of the book. And that will be done by Sir Chkwuma-Machukwu Ume, SAN, former Attorney General Imo State, and the Principal Solicitor Chkwuma-Machukwu Ume, SAN. My SAN.
The Great Honorable Chairman, the distinguished Senator, the Senate Minority Leader, our own Dr. Manobe Omoibi, and the respected traditional ruler. I please stand on the existing protocol. My work is a little bit simple one. A review of the work we came here to present. The scars of the generation, of our generation, perspectives on racism by a wonderful gentleman, Alphonsus G.A.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, for us to understand what this book is all about, there's need for us to have a perception, an understanding of who the author is. Summarily, Alphonsus G.A. is a very intelligent, quietly studying mind. He's not a boisterous human being. He's intelligent, always quiet, but study. Again, another thing with him is he's a globally traveled person. And while in these travels, he was serving his fatherland as an envoy. So these characters, plus others, enabled him to write this book. Now, scars of our generation perspective on racism. If we are to understand this, there is need for us to know what each of the words in the title stand for. Take, for instance, the word scars. The presence of that clause, the scars, is not by coincidence. One, you recall that the word scar implies the remnants of a depressing problem bequeathed to one's generation. It is also about an ongoing problem that is frightening a generation. So it comes from the past, and it is also present with us. Then the word our generation. The fact is that for us to look at this book, it's very important we don't look at generation as it is with us today. Because when the next person, when in a century's time, somebody picks the book and read, he will be looking at it as per the problem of that period. So invariably, our generation today is for today and is for the future people. And there is something we need to also bear in mind. Issue of racism is not an issue that is easily to go away. Not when our generation goes, the problem will go. It has been there. From when you look at the book of Genesis, all the chapters in the Old Testament, the question of racism and racial superiority continues to be a recurring measure. So, we have to bear this book we are going to unveil today. Just like the Animal Farm, written many years ago, shapes the thought of the world today. We are likely to have it that in many years to come, this fine work, Skies of Our Generation, will be a guiding and a point of reference on the issue of racism. Now another one. Why is it that Alphonsus G.A is able to write authoritatively on this? George Allen is a knight of Roman Catholic Church and knows in the Bible the role racism has played. I want to call your attention to the issue of, in the New Testament, why Christ highlighted the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is the problem racism is blocking us from knowing. This idea of cross-border classification is quite very wrong. Because in every 12, you must have a Judas. That is the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, having done all this small introduction, let me go on to say that the book has several preludes. But of particular interest is the foreword written by Ambassador Dr. Martin Omoribe, a brilliant retired Permanent Secretary of Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Another part of that prelude is prefaced by the author. As regards the foreword, I believe that the author's father must have told him what my father, Chief Basil Umebinyo, Lusike, one of Apollo, told me when I was in the primary school. It is better to be a slave to a philosopher than to be a master to a fool. The author worked under Dr. Omoibe. Yes. Oh, great. You know the spelling is. Yes. They worked together in the foreign affairs, and the author has remained eager to learn from him. We too are going to learn from the great mind. Take, for instance, what he said in the foreword. United States of America, the epicenter of world attention and perhaps the most diverse knowledge of races, has at the forefront has been at the forefront in an attempt to interrogate and the seemingly intractable problem of racism. To stem the tidal wave of race-induced social firement, America has taken such proactive measures as Emancipation Proclamation and the 30th Amendment, among other legal instruments. However, it would seem this violent onslaught on racism has been, by and large, unavailing as the fire of racism rages on. He goes on to conclude, a familiar failing of books of this kind is their author's intention to be in denial by seeking a completely absorb the blacks all over the world of the blame for the historical racism that their forefathers suffered and the temporary racism which the descendants suffered. The author rises above this by being courageous enough to draw his readers' attention to the less talked about trends of racism perpetrated by the blacks against blacks and variously called tribalism and xenophobia. As we go on in the chapters of the work, you see where the ambassador is referring to as the author also laid the blame on the blacks. We thank you, Ambassador. When cerebral minds rise, people find reading enjoyable. We are grateful. Now about the preface. The author gave a pointer to enrich intellectual work embedded in the book. These are his words. The author sojourned in Central Europe as a diplomat also exposed him to many libraries and historical measures. Please let's not lose advantage of that word. Such libraries. Which means, while he was there, libraries were his port of calls. So, his writing this book is a matter of character. It's not a matter of coincidence. Now he said, there are many libraries and historical museums which enrich his knowledge of slavery and racism that occurred since 12th century. Which means issue of slavery have been with us for as long as the world had existed. The authors continued. He said, it is authors which that the public policy planners, especially on education, will not discard the study of history in their curriculum development efforts, so as not to create any gap in knowledge of Africa and the world in general. We are grateful to the author. Now we ask, why this removal of the study of history from our school curriculum? Having done this introduction, let me now go to the main work. The 90-page book is arranged in 8 chapters with postscripts and 2 appendices. In chapter 1, the author traces the origin of slavery. That's how he put it. The origin of slavery are not lost to human history. It is sometimes hypothesized that at some moment it was decided that persons detained for crime or as a result of warfare would be more useful if put into work in some way instead of being killed outright or discarded or eaten. However, it is not known if and when that first started. So it was a human being's genius approach of rather than killing people captured during the war or people caught committing crime against the public, instead of killing them, they were put into a different use, which is slavery. Because of slavery is known to have existed as early as Shang Dynasty, 18th to 12th century in China. For most of that period, slaves were generated in the same ways as they were elsewhere, including capture in war, slave raiding, and sale of insolvent debtors. In chapter 2, he went to give us a further brilliant analysis of the magnetism of the African and European relationship 400 years before the colonial time. He put it this way: to discuss trade between Africans and Europeans in the 4 centuries before colonial rule is to discuss slave trade. For 4 centuries, 400 years before colonial period started, what was regulating the relationship between Africans and Europe was slave trade. So you can imagine in these 400 years how many were loaded out of Africa into Europe as slaves. Before that, he was first a free man and then a captive. Chapter 3 of the book has important insightful information on slavery. The role of slavery, let me pick the words of the author. the role of slavery in promoting racist prejudice and ideology has been carefully studied in certain situations, especially in USA. The simple fact that no people can enslave another for centuries. The simple fact that no people can enslave another for centuries without coming out with a notion of superiority. And when the color and other physical traits of these people are quite different, it was inevitable that the prejudice would take a racist form. So this is how the justification of the slavery, how it be. If you enslave somebody for years, it means you have to promote something to show why you are superior and why that other will continue. The author went on to say that within Africa itself, the same can be said of the situation in Cape Province of South Africa, where white men were establishing military and social superiority over non-whites ever since 1650. This is another way of a deliberate conscious justification, because you must justify why you have to make your fellow human being below and inferior to you. The author went on to outline the contradictions of different values extended to the whites and the opposite of same method to the blacks. Again, I quote his words. There was always a contradiction between the elaboration of democratic values inside Europe and the elaboration of authoritarian and racist practices by Europeans with respect to Africans. When the French Revolution was made in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it did not extend to the black Africans who were enslaved by the French in the West Indies and Indian Ocean. Indeed, France fought against the effort of these people to emancipate themselves. A different code for the Africans, and liberty, equality, and fraternity for the whites. The author continued. Racial prejudice reached its peak in the United States of America during the period when the first matter in the American National War of Liberation against the British colonies in the 18th century was an African descendant, Cyprus Atticus. And both enslaved and free Africans played a key role in Washington's army. And yet, the American Constitution, with its famous preamble that all men are created equal, sanctioned upon the existence of that Constitution that said all men are created equal, upon the role they played in ensuring that American independence is secured for the British. Yet that Constitution sanctioned the continued enslavement of Africans and American Indians. Unfortunately, the author never mentioned the said conquering of the Hausa Kingdom in 1804 or into 1808 during the Fulani invasion. The author must have forgotten to remember that what the Hausas are necessarily going through in the midst of the constitutional provision of majority rule is a manifestation of racial discrimination in their fatherland. The author may have forgotten to inform us that unless this constitutional anomaly is corrected, the rest of Nigeria will be a stranger and tenants in their fatherland. In chapter 4 to 6, unlike the book of Jeremiah in the Bible, the lamentation of the Old Testament, the author in those chapters bemoans the different phases of racism and the ugly effects of the psychic and optimal development of individuals and nations. Glimpses of hope. In a great manner, the author in chapter 7, titled Challenge and the Way Forward, gave a narration, a very long narration, starting with the word Frederick, a runaway slave who took a pencil in his hand and wrote, "My bondage and my freedom." He narrated a lot of them. He goes on in that chapter 6 and reached to Michael Jordan in page 7, the basketball star, the Tiger Wood, and all that. But in my own case, something struck me, my mind, when I was reading all this. When I see all he narrated, I was forced to take a look at the year the book was published. And I saw that it was published in 2019. I'm sure if this book, The Scars of Our Generation Perspective on Racism, was published in the later months of 2020, the brilliant author would have added a new phenomenon in the US presidential election, which the US presidential election threw up in the US polity. The untying of the votes of the blacks and the colored. Hitherto, their votes were massively taken away individually in millions, but in such a manner that each disfranchised individual innocently felt it was a mere omission. It was a constructive, or in the words of Chief Obafemi Awolowo, the great sage and my idol, subtle omission. When the Democrats felt that the lack of these friendly votes would undermine their victory, they had no option than to block those lapses. To some politicians, ensuring that every black and the colored, the right to vote could mean rigging, because such has not been the case. In pages 39 to 46 is chapter 8, which turns out to be the conclusion. And the author, among other things, reminded us about the work of James Emeritus, a black civil rights veteran who was shot while on 220-mile one-man march from Memphis to Jackson, tagged March Against Fear. Nigerians must march against fear. I sincerely think that the willpower of the Lagos State, particularly the House of Assembly who enacted their financial crime, cannot be fought. The financial crime cannot be fought from one-sided federal commission. States can fight crime. In page 44, he subtly told us the discrimination is also in the midst of people of the same race. And that's what the ambassador referred in the foreword as also highlighting the lapses among the people of the same race. An example is what is known the Osu caste system in Igbo land, and concluded in page 46. The Osu system is one practice Igbo communities must do away with in order to experience true modernity, enlightenment, and civilization in the 21st century. In the postscripts, the author idealized the victory of Senator Barack Hussein Obama. In fact, a whole lot of pages 47 to 51 were devoted to the said victory. All I can say is that, bearing in mind that when a child is born, all of us are always happy. But we need to be more careful, because when Adolf Hitler was born, we also were happy. The world was happy. The public around him was happy. But what Hitler turned out to be is a different story. The gas chamber. Hussein Obama's victory at the White House was gladdening, but was his presidency a good omen to the Nigerian polity? On the two appendices, I take special interest on the second appendix. What did the black man do to deserve this suffering? Without wasting your time, I must say that this last appendix seemed to have made a lie of what the author proclaimed in his preface. The choice of the title of this book was born out of the author's conscious belief in the equality of all human beings, irrespective of color of their skin. If that is the case, why did plaintiff cry? Why did the black man deserve this suffering? Israelites were slaves to the Egyptian pharaohs. Today, are they still slaves? Why are black leaders and nations still remain robots in the hands of their erstwhile slave masters? Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, my SAN. The Great Seal. Before we go on, I have to recognize the presence of the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Women Affairs, Ambassador Antonia Eba. She's physically in this premises, but she has preferred to sit at the floor below. Having his staff already seated here, she humbly did not want to displace him.